Hello, welcome everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today I am delighted to talk again to Imran Mullah. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good to see you back. For those who don't remember, Imran studies history at the University of Cambridge. He has written for the Critic, Conservative Home, Athwart, Middle East Eye, and Traversing Tradition, amongst others. On Saturday, the 14th of January 2023, Prince Mukarram Jah, the titular Nizam of Hyderabad, died in Istanbul at the age of 89. Few people know that he was nominated Caliph by the last Ottoman Caliph. Wow. In a recently published article on the popular website Middle East Eye, Imran tells the fascinating story which takes us from Istanbul to the French Riviera and Hyderabad. So would you like to tell us the story, Imran?
Yes, so it's an extraordinary story, I think. It's not a secret, but it's very little known. And so if you read any popular history of the Ottoman Empire, if you watch any documentary on the Ottomans or on the caliphate, the khilafah, then you're most likely not going to come across this story because people generally tend not to look at it. They end the story with the abolition of the khilafah, of the caliphate, and then sort of they leave it at that, and they don't look at what happened afterwards. And it's a remarkable event. We have Republicans in Istanbul, we have a former caliph on the French Riviera, and we have the world's richest man in India. And after the First World War, they all became embroiled in this extraordinary story. So I think we should begin with the 3rd of March, 1924. So next year, it will be the 100th year anniversary of when the young Republic of Turkey abolished the Ottoman Caliphate. And this was obviously cataclysmic because to be caliph was to claim the loyalty of the world's Muslims. Now, the position had never been undisputed. But after this, the Muslim world, which was largely under the yoke of European imperialism, was left leaderless. So why was it done? The move was part of the nation-building project pursued by the government of Turkey, which was, of course, a secularist government led by Mustafa Kemal. It was they who had fought European occupation. They'd founded the nation out of the ruins of the collapsed Ottoman Empire. And the Kemalists believed that to fashion modern Turkey, they had to essentially annihilate all serious remnants of the old order, which had been Ottoman and Islamic. So in November 1922, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey abolished the Ottoman Sultanate and they deposed Sultan Mehmed. And then a prince called Abdülmecid, who had never been involved in the running of the empire, was installed as a puppet figure, and he became Caliph Abdülmecid II. And the idea was he'd keep a low profile in the Dolmabahce Palace on the shores of the Bosphorus, and he'd basically stay hidden away and not involve himself in public affairs. Unfortunately for the government, Abdülmecid had no intention of doing anything of the sort. He was an impressive man in his own right. He was a talented pianist, he was a cellist, a calligrapher, a painter. He wasn't a timid pushover. And so he rode his white horse through the streets like the sultans of old in regal fashion. He showed up at the Hagia Sophia Mosque for the Friday prayer. He appeared before his adoring crowds, and he even hosted grand receptions in his palace. And so he insisted on behaving basically as though the Ottoman Empire still existed.
That must be a provocation to Ataturk, actually, to see this caliph on a white horse going to Hagia Sophia, presumably on Friday for Jummah prayers, when the leader of the Muslims, the imam, would have turned up. So that was quite a provocation to Ataturk, I would have thought.
Yes, for the government, this was intolerable. And that was why anti-monarchical sentiment, which was very strong among the government, developed into a call to do away with the caliphate once and for all. But at the same time, in India, the caliphate movement, or the khilafat movement, was raising a resounding clamor in support of Abdülmecid. So the caliphate movement, it had been established in 1919 by a coalition of Indian Muslims. And the aim was basically to pressure the British Empire into protecting the office of the caliphate. And the British were obviously concerned by this. They saw the movement as a potential problem for their authority, because the colonial project was about engineering Islam to be conducive to British interests. So
I've got to pause you there. It's too much of a temptation. Engineering Islam to serve British interests. It hasn't changed very much, has it?
No, there's a book by Joseph Massad called Islam in Liberalism, and he illustrates this point very well. He takes us all the way from the late 19th century through this period until the present day to show how that is the liberal project, basically.
Yeah. Sorry, it was very juicy. I couldn't resist. Carry on, please.
And so British colonialism was naturally, it felt threatened by the prospect of some kind of global Islamic kinship that could transcend states and transcend empires. It wasn't happy about that. And even more anxiety inducing for British officials was the fact that the caliphate movement became a mass mobilization of Indians across religious lines. So Mahatma Gandhi and other prominent nationalists seized the day and joined in, and they basically presented the movement as a glorious show of unity, Hindu-Muslim unity against Britain.
It's very naughty of me. I apologize. You just said something I really didn't expect to ever hear. You're saying Mahatma Gandhi. He was not a Muslim, obviously. A Hindu, perhaps. So you're saying there was Hindu-Muslim collaboration, alliance together in a highly political movement in India. I mean, the contrast today is just astonishing, without getting sidetracked into all that, of course. I just want to emphasize what you've just said as a remarkable, and this is the historic reality of Muslim Hindu relations, one of cooperation and even collaboration on important political matters.
Yes, and of course that was to change in future years with the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan, and with the sort of the fall apart of the Congress Party, of Muslims in the Congress Party. But the Congress Party, which was the mainstream independence movement, its senior leaders, including Gandhi, supported the Caliphate movement. And one of the leaders of the Caliphate movement was Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who then went on to be president of the Congress Party. And he opposed partition famously. He served in government of independent India. So this movement is sort of very important in the sense that the individuals involved in it then went on to do lots of sort of very significant things. But the leader of the movement was Maulana Shaukat Ali, and he was an anglicized former civil servant, former student at Aligarh University, which is a kind of English-style modernist university. But he dramatically transformed himself into a daring nationalist. And in World War I, he wrote a series of seditious articles supporting the Ottoman Empire. And so, unsurprisingly, the British imprisoned him. But that did nothing to hurt his career. In 1919, while he was in jail, he won the election and became president of the Caliphate movement.
Wow.
And his mother, B. Amma, she was called, also became a significant figure in the movement, and she addressed large meetings around the country. So very interesting stuff. But the mobilization enjoyed a lot of success basically in helping the anti-colonial struggle. But then when Turkey won its independence and Mustafa Kemal abolished the Ottoman Sultanate, the Caliphate movement was left in a complicated position. They didn't really know what was going to happen. So in November 1923, the movement and its prominent allies sent a letter to the Prime Minister of Turkey, and basically urging him to give the Caliphate its due prominence as a focal point of solidarity for the world's Muslims. And the next month, the Jamiat Ulema-e-Hind, which is a congregation of Indian Islamic scholars, still around today, still very significant, suggested that scholars from around the Muslim world should convene to discuss the status of the Caliphate. Now, these global Muslim ambitions clashed dramatically with the Kemalist vision of secular nation building. So the Turkish government condemned attempted foreign intervention, they called it, and they used the Caliphate movement, as well as claims of a pro-Ottoman monarchist plot in Turkey, as a pretext to abolish the Caliphate in March 1924. So for the Caliphate's movement's leaders, this was an unexpected and devastating development.
This actually backfired, wasn't it? So you had this great movement, people like Gandhi joining it in India, and moving ahead and so on. And then the whole thing just so freaked out Ataturk, I guess, is sort of obviously as an existential threat to his new regime of militant secularism. I mean, I've been to Istanbul. I remember hearing, he drew a lot from France, French laicite, this kind of very hardline secularist ethos and political system. But it backfired, and it had the opposite consequence to the intended outcome, which was its, repression, abolition completely. Extraordinary.
Yes, and you're right. The Kemalist government then went on to change to a Latin alphabet. They banned various forms of Islamic clothing. They outlawed
the fez, of course, famously. This red hat was banned in Turkey. Yeah.
Indeed, and they sort of made it so that the call to prayer had to be in Turkish, not Arabic. Really? But for the royal family, now that the caliphate was abolished, they were expelled from Istanbul unceremoniously. They were put on the Orient Express, and they ended up in Switzerland, where they didn't have any money. And there's a report from the Daily Mail at the time, which said that the ex-caliph spends his days in prayer, painting, and composing music. Eventually, the family moved to the south of France, and financially, they weren't in a good place. And it was from an unexpected place that monetary assistance would come, and that was Hyderabad. Hyderabad, it was a princely state in southern India, the size of Italy, so very big, very significant, and it was under indirect British control. It was
indirect. You mean British didn't rule it directly? So you mean that they were the power behind the facade, whatever that was?
Yes, the princely states in India were sort of outside of British India proper. So they weren't administered directly by Britain, but they were controlled ultimately by Britain through these sort of puppet rulers who did have a measure of autonomy, but not sort of total autonomy. But so Hyderabad was governed by the Muslim Asaf Jah dynasty, and this was a dynasty which had risen to power under the Mughal Empire. And Hyderabad's ruler, the seventh Nizam, the Nizam was the ruler of Hyderabad. He was called Usman Ali Khan, and he was generally thought to be the world's richest man. So he employed 12,000 palace servants, including 3,000 North African bodyguards. He had a harem with over 80 concubines. He used a £50 million diamond as a paperweight. He drove around in a Rolls Royce, and he set up his own whiskey distillery as well.
A Muslim ruler set up his own whiskey distillery, as well as having goodness knows how many servants and whatnot. Gosh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, and Hyderabad existed under the watchful and you could say often concerned eye of the British Empire as an almost implausible relic of a bygone era. So it was a sort of last vestige of the Mughal past, and the extravagance of elite life there was legendary. Hyderabad's palaces were drenched with opulence and an old-fashioned Indo-Islamic grandeur. The Nizam procured antique illuminated copies of the Quran, lots of very significant Islamic art. He was a talented poet, so he would roam the perfumed rooms of his palace, composing verse in Persian and Urdu. He had Qawwali masters in the royal court, performing renditions of mystical poetry. And there's a quote from one visitor to the Nizam's court, which I'll just read you. And it says, "The effete, the supercilious, the curious, the coarse, the delicate, the pleasure-loving, and effeminate all passed through the court of Hyderabad." And the Nizam hosted grand dinners with, you can imagine what the food was like. There were garden parties with a 60-piece string orchestra. The Nizam had his own jazz band as well, which he led it in performing his favorite song, "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles."
Hang on. All that money, all that refinement, his favorite song was "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles."
Yeah.
Oh, what a waste. Sorry.
Well, so I'm going to get onto that. He's often basically stereotyped as being kind of really decadent, and then at the same time quite miserly. So later in his life, he would sort of always wear the same clothes, and he was once furious with someone for trying to charge him too much for ice cream. So he's stereotyped as being miserly, but I think this is basically unfair. His reign saw relatively good governance compared with British India. He was enormously popular with his people, so he set up India's first Urdu university. He made primary education free for everyone. There were railways built, power stations. They redeveloped slums into housing colonies, and dams were built as well. So Hyderabad had a reliable supply of drinking water, which was extremely rare in the Indian subcontinent. And then there's also the point of religious tolerance. The Nizam emphasized religious pluralism to his mainly Hindu subjects. So he would patronize mosques and Sufi shrines, but also temples and churches and gurdwaras, and he declared Muslims and Hindus are my two eyes. And of course, Hyderabad was a majority Hindu state. And despite being stereotyped as miserly, he used goods that were only produced in Hyderabad. So he would buy items from auctions just to help struggling families. He chain smoked cigarettes from sort of a local place just to help the industry there. And so he felt guilty for not supporting the Ottoman Empire before its collapse, and recognizing the importance of the now vanished caliphate. He wanted to help the former caliph. And so he proposed giving Abdul Majid and his household £300 a month, and the exiled Ottomans sort of living on Hyderabadi money ended up in a nice 19th century villa overlooking Nice. And the former caliph was often sighted on the beach carrying a parasol. Elsewhere, scheming was afoot. Maulana Shaukat Ali, who we heard about, he led the caliphate movement. He was now working with a man called Marmaduke Pictou, who was an Englishman employed by the Nizam to translate the Quran into English. And behind closed doors, I've
got to pause you there. It's such an important thing there. So the Pictou translation of the Quran, of course, to English is a very famous, world famous English translation, from the 19th century or whatever. I mean, it might not be used much today, but hugely important translation by a Muslim convert to Islam, obviously an Englishman. So I just wanted to stress the significance of that.
And Pictou was a very significant character. He'd sort of been involved in the freedom struggle. Then he'd moved to Hyderabad. He produced a journal called Islamic Culture, and he was sort of well liked by the Nizam. So together with Maulana Shaukat Ali, they plotted basically to bring together the House of Usman, the Ottoman dynasty, and the Asaf Jah dynasty that ruled Hyderabad. The Nizam wouldn't have dreamed of adopting the title of caliph himself, because he needed legitimacy. The British wouldn't countenance the idea. So their plan centered on having the Nizam's son, Azam Jah, who was a young man who'd been educated at Harrow and Cambridge in England, marry the former caliph's daughter, the Princess Duru-Shevar. And for good measure, they also proposed marrying her cousin, Nilufar, to a younger son of the Nizam called Muazzam Jah. So a potential obstacle to the plan, though, was that three other rulers also wanted to marry members of their dynasties to those two girls, the King of Egypt, King Faisal of Iraq, and the Shah of Persia. And so there was a bidding war. But for Abdul Majid, the former caliph, the Nizam's generosity in supporting his family financially was too important to ignore. So in the summer of 1931, the Nizam's representatives met Abdul Majid in London to negotiate the dowry. The talks were nearly derailed over arguments, but eventually the marriage was arranged. The two princes, Azam and Muazzam Jah, arrived at a luxurious hotel in Nice. They signed the marriage contract at the Palais Carabasel, which was also in Nice. And the Nizam sent Abdul Majid a message saying, and I quote, "An alliance has been established between the two ancient and historic dynasties, which, it is hoped, has prospects of a bright future." And Azam Jah, the eldest son who had married Princess Duru-Shevar, he had no interest in becoming the next Nizam. And the Nizam, Usman Ali Khan, was happy with this. He wanted a child of both the Asaf Jah and Ottoman dynasties, his grandson, as his heir. So the married couples arrived in India. The British were very concerned, and the overworked British resident in Hyderabad wrote to the viceroy of an open revival of the scheme to bring the caliphate to Hyderabad. And that's what it looked like. Maulana Shaukat Ali went to Palestine that very same year for the World Islamic Congress, which he had organized with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And he was under close British surveillance at the time. And his plan was to use this conference to mobilize support from across the Muslim world for basically reviving the institution of the caliphate. And British spies reported it as his scheme for a pan-Islamic federation. But this failed. By all accounts, there was internal discord, and not everyone agreed at the conference that the Ottomans should be supported as leaders of the Muslims. You know, others, they wanted various other leaders to be the next caliph. And in any case, there was no Muslim power that could really claim enough strength to challenge colonial designs. So it came to nothing in the end. But amid all this, the newly married couples were settling into their new lives. And you can imagine Hyderabad was nothing like Istanbul. It was worlds apart from the French Riviera. And yet the two young women adapted to the situation remarkably well. So Princess Duru Shevar learned to speak fluent Urdu. She became a very prominent figure in Hyderabad. She patronized hospitals. She set up charities. She even set up a junior college for girls. And her cousin Nilufar became a fashion icon, and she was known for merging European and Indian styles in her clothing. And the two young women basically became celebrities. And then in late 1933 came the moment that everyone had been waiting for, which was that Princess Duru Shevar gave birth to a son. And he was Mukarram Jah, who of course has just passed away. And he was the result of the union between the caliphal family and the richest household in the Muslim world. His grandfather on his paternal side was the Nizam of Hyderabad. On the maternal side, it was the former caliph Abdul Majid II. And he was poised to be the heir, the next Nizam, and leader of the world's Muslims. So a historian called John Zubrichiki has written in his book called The Last Nizam. It's a very good book. I highly recommend it. That British officials were shocked when they discovered in Abdul Majid's will, Abdul Majid finally, he passed away in 1944, that Abdul Majid had nominated Mukarram Jah, his grandson, to be the next caliph. And this was only natural because Abdul Majid had no other successors. Can you just explain why the British were so disturbed, anxious about the birth of Mukarram Jah? Why was this a problem potentially for them? Well, the interesting thing is that it wasn't as much of a problem for them as if the Nizam had tried to sort of claim the caliphate on the basis of the union, which obviously wasn't feasible. And they would have presumably put a stop to that. But what happened here is that they thought, well, this is a situation to watch. Right now, at least, Hyderabad is sort of under our control. You know, claiming to be the caliph meant nothing substantively without political power. Now, the Nizam, Osman Ali Khan, he'd always believed that he should be treated as an equal by the British. So they saw him as fairly uppity, but they were willing to sort of deal with that situation and just keep an eye on it. And in any case, none of this was to be, because India was sort of coming closer to independence, and it wasn't India's princes that were shaping the political scene. It was the forces of democratization represented by the Congress Party. So Maulana Shaukat Ali, he went on to be a major player in Indian Muslim politics. In 1936, he joined the Muslim League. He became a close ally of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was styling himself leader of India's Muslims at that time. And obviously in 1940, the Muslim League declared their demand for an independent Muslim state, Pakistan. So Maulana Shaukat Ali went on to be involved in the Pakistan movement, although he passed away before the idea really came to fruition. So he died in 1938, I believe. But that just shows that the caliphate movement had this sort of interesting afterlife where its leaders went on to do sort of very significant things. And so there's that link there with the creation of Pakistan. But in terms of Hyderabad, well, India sort of went down this road which looked like it would end up at partition. All sides tried to reach a kind of compromise where they could have an Indian federation with strong regional autonomy and sort of virtual independence for Muslim regions. So it was basically the proposed idea was something that wouldn't be like a normal nation state. The center would be weak and would control things like defense, military, and Muslim majority provinces would have their own sort of independence, as would other provinces. But this whole thing fell apart in 1946, and by 1947, India was set for an actual partition, so for Pakistan to be created. So what was going to happen to Hyderabad? No one wanted the sort of politics to disrupt their way of life. The Nizam had no intentions of giving up his power, and he actually saw this as sort of a perfect moment to make Hyderabad sovereign and autonomous. So he wanted an independent Hyderabad, and he wanted his heir, Mukarram Jah, ultimately to succeed him upon his death, to be a great and powerful leader and caliph of the world's Muslims. Because Hyderabad, we should remember, it had a large economy, it was the size of Italy, and so its leaders thought that it could be very significant in the Muslim world, essentially, and that would sort of be a perfect time for Mukarram Jah to sort of claim the mantle of caliph, and it would have legitimacy because of the Ottoman connection, his grandfather, and of course the wealth and the power would also sort of give it that added kind of relevance. It means nothing to say I'm the caliph if no one supports you and you don't have any political power. And of course, these ambitions were never to be. When India and Pakistan won their independence, Hyderabad's status was precarious. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, now the leader of Pakistan, he advised the Nizam not to submit to India. And he warned the British Viceroy that if Congress tries to move against Hyderabad, every Muslim in the Indian subcontinent is going to rise up, which was sort of some posturing there that emboldened the authorities in Hyderabad. But the Indian government was never going to allow this massive Muslim-ruled state with a Hindu majority to be sort of in the middle of Indian territory. It made absolutely no sense. They were never going to sort of tolerate it. So in 1948, autumn 1948, Jinnah sadly died, and chaos erupted in Pakistan. And in that position, Pakistan was unable to sort of do any military intervention on Hyderabad's behalf. And so less than 2 days later, the Indian army invaded Hyderabad and the state was annexed to India. Now, this was an absolutely devastating event because independent reports suggest at least tens of thousands of Muslims died in the invasion. Indian army officers have been accused of committing war crimes. Privately, when Prime Minister Nehru of India heard about how many Muslims were killed, he was absolutely horrified, and he thought it staggered the imagination. That was the phrase used, because these were atrocities being committed on the ground rather than being sort of directed by the government. But it was an absolutely sort of awful invasion, and Hyderabad, of course, would never be the same. Immense loss of life. So many people were left homeless and became refugees, and the Nizam and that dynasty lost all its real power. So Princess Durrushavar...
Sorry, Hyderabad today is part of India, obviously.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so it was incorporated then into the nation state of India. And meanwhile, Princess Durrushavar, she went to London with her 2 sons, including Mukarram Jah, and she lived in London's Savoy Hotel for the next 2 years. Mukarram Jah, he went to Harrow and then to Cambridge, like his father had done. And then Usman Ali Khan, the 7th Nizam, passed away in 1967. And that was when Mukarram Jah became the new Nizam. but it was just a title at that point. He had no power. And what's more, he had a legally disputed inheritance, so a vast inheritance, as we know, which was claimed by thousands of people. So this wasn't a good situation for him. And then in 1974, the Indian government abolished the Nizam's title and sort of placed loads of new taxes and land acts on him. And so in the end, the dynasty had to sell off a significant amount of their property. And Mukarram Jah was only the titular Nizam, but sort of not recognized as such. There was no title recognized anymore in India. And he then he moved to Australia, sort of defying all expectations. And he had a small sheep farm there, and he enjoyed driving bulldozers. And now he moved then to...
You couldn't make this up, could you?
No.
First of all, the family moved to the Riviera of all places, perhaps more understandable. But then to become a sheep herder in the Australian outback, it's not obvious that one would do that.
Yes, driving bulldozers, which you can imagine it must have been such an awful environment over there in Hyderabad that he just wanted to get away. Yeah. He then lived for the rest of his life in a small apartment in Istanbul, and the locals obviously would have had no idea that this man was sort of nominated to be caliph by Abdul Majid II, and he that was where he passed away in Istanbul. But he always kept that connection to Hyderabad through charitable initiatives, and they were doing sort of renovations of the palaces once they'd finally sort of got a hold of them again. And he had a son, Prince Azmat Jah.
The point of this video, of course, is the son. This is the point really, and his significance today. So sorry.
Yes. So Azmat Jah is a British filmmaker. He's a filmmaker. He's worked with Richard Attenborough, sorry, not David Attenborough.
And he's a David Attenborough film. That means he'll be living in the jungle or something.
yeah. But Richard Attenborough and Steven Spielberg, so two very big directors. So he's a professional filmmaker, but he has also been very involved in trying to restore Hyderabad's cultural heritage. And he was actually in Hyderabad when his father Mukarram Jah tragically passed away last week. And Mukarram Jah was his body was taken to Hyderabad, and he was buried there. And just 2 days ago, Azmat Jah had his coronation, and he is now the 9th Nizam of Hyderabad. And of course, he is the man with probably the strongest legal claim to the title of caliph, because his father was the would-be caliph, as it were. But of course, they've shown no indication of wanting to claim that title, and why should they really? Because it doesn't mean anything without sort of political power or sovereignty.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. So Mukarram Jah, a few people know, as I said at the beginning, was nominated caliph by the last Ottoman Caliph, of all things. The thing is, I mean, many people might say that he was simply a bygone relic from the past with no actual power, as you have rightly indicated. The symbol that the power is meaningless. So what is the significance of his passing for Muslims today? Why should we even talk about him? Why bother, to be crude? I mean, what's the significance?
Well, when a figure like this passes away, it's the end of a bygone era in a way. It's significant just for that reason. But it is tempting to see this as no more, like you say, as no more than the story of the downfall of a wealthy elite who were very sad about the loss of their extreme privilege and prestige. But we could say, well, it also meant the crumbling of the last vestige of a sophisticated and tolerant Indo-Islamic culture, which sort of shaped the Muslim world in a very significant way. And its worldview and the beauty there, it was important not just to a small nobility, but to a whole people, to the Muslims of India. And in India today, its very memory is threatened with annihilation. This is India, where historic mosques are demolished, where street names and city names that are Islamic are being changed. It's the attempted annihilation of the memory of this civilization. And so it's very important to preserve sort of the memory of this story, which has sort of sadly been largely forgotten. And we might also note that what made this failed plan so extraordinary was that its key players, so people like Caliph Abdul Majid II, Maulana Shaukat Ali, and Nizam Usman Ali Khan, they all opposed the modern nationalism that was ascendant at the time. So they dreamt of Muslim autonomy. They dreamt of a Muslim solidarity that could shatter geographical boundaries, and that dream has never truly disappeared. And of course, it's present in that union between the Ottomans, sort of a very long way away, and India, and it's transnational Islamic solidarity that sort of cuts across national boundaries.
Okay, just focus for a second, if we can. Why is the role or office of caliph important in Islam, and what exactly is it? Because you mentioned, technically he was, but there was no political power. But nevertheless, what is it? What are we talking about here for those who are not familiar with the idea?
So the caliphate is an institution that began right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the first caliph was Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, the companion of the Prophet. And then the caliphate, to be caliph really meant to be successor of the Prophet. So the caliphate was succession to the Prophet Muhammad. And what it meant in practical terms is that it was to claim the loyalty and leadership of the world's Muslims. And the caliphate endured as an institution for nearly 1,400 years. And obviously it was never sort of uninterrupted. So the caliphate passed from dynasty to dynasty, and it was eventually with the Ottoman. Often it was contested, so different people wanted to be caliph, but it was with the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, and the Ottoman Empire was so powerful that sort of no one really could have any significant claim to the caliphate while the Ottoman Caliphate was still around. And as Ottoman power waned and declined, it became more and more important for the Ottomans to actually stress their role as the caliphate, because they wanted to sort of bolster legitimacy. So when the Ottomans lost a lot of territory that was non-Muslim in the 19th century, suddenly their empire for the first time became sort of much more Muslim in its population. And so it was convenient for the Ottomans to then start really stressing the Islamic element of the caliphate. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II in the late 19th century, he promoted a policy of basically trying to project his caliphal duties to Muslims that weren't in the Ottoman Empire and that were elsewhere, like India. And the caliphate became very important to lots of Muslims elsewhere because they were all under European colonial rule. So Muslims in India didn't really care too much about the Ottomans while they had their own powerful Muslim rulers. In the 18th century, when this started to change, you had people fighting the British like Tipu Sultan. They asked the Ottomans for help. The Ottomans didn't give Tipu Sultan any help. But then after 1857, when the last Mughal emperor was deposed, suddenly the Muslims of India were just under British control. And it was then that they started to look somewhere else. They started to look at the caliph in Istanbul. And this was obviously very disturbing for the British because they saw it as a threat of disloyalty.
I just love how the paradox here that liberalism, political liberalism, I think of J.S. Mill, the great English philosopher of the 19th century, his book On Liberty, great book, stressing freedom, individual liberty and so on. And this is very much, one could argue, for home consumption, for English people, mainly males, of course, white males, to rejoice in this ideology and express their individualism. But when it came to Britain abroad, external Britain in the empire, then individualism, freedom, of course, was not tolerated. Or I suppose it was, as long as it wasn't perceived to threaten the interests of Britain back in England. So it was a very conditional freedom, which wasn't really expressed in J.S. Mill's work at all. That wasn't an issue. You're perfectly free as long as you don't threaten the government in Whitehall. Whoever said that, it was freedom. So it's kind of freedom within the UK, or England rather, but outside, wasn't really the case. And they, as you say, they locked people up if they were perceived to be a threat to Britain's commercial or military interests in all parts of the globe, where nothing to do with Britain, really.
Yes, exactly. That's completely correct. And what they demanded, obviously, was a loyalty to the empire. And so, if there were loads of Muslims saying, actually, we really like that Ottoman Caliph over there in Istanbul, that wasn't too good for the British. And of course, we might note that the Kemalists in the Republic of Turkey, there was a reason they had to abolish the caliphate, which was that was sort of a threat to their government authority as well, to have a sort of another kind of leader that was a sort of a relic of the Ottoman past. I mean, they didn't want that, and that was why they abolished the caliphate. And they were actually extremely disturbed by the union with Hyderabad. So after the marriage between Princess Durushavar and Azam Jah, the Turkish embassy in London sort of kicked up a fuss and complained. They called it, the caliphal plot. So they understood that there was something going on there to do with the Ottomans, that they really didn't want the old Ottoman past sort of rearing its head.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. So, I mean, just coming back to today, in Turkey, in Istanbul, you have a country, I mean, having been there briefly only a couple of times, very, very nationalistic. You've got pictures of Kemal, statues of Kemal, you name it, all over the place. And it's completely forbidden, of course, to criticize or in any way revile or let alone mock Ataturk in any way whatsoever. But nevertheless, you have President Erdogan, who is an interesting figure. Election coming up. Is it this year now, in June, July or something? Election in Turkey, I think. Yeah, which is really crucial, because if he loses, I'm not saying he will, but the forces of secularism who are there in the opposition, of course, might well. I've been told this anyway. If they came to power, a lot of his pro-Islamic reforms might well disappear from the scene. But within, I don't know how well versed you are in Turkish politics. There are the Ottoman loyalists. I met some of them in Istanbul still, and some of them are young people, of course. But is the idea of the caliphate alive still there? I'm talking about in Anatolia itself, or is that now gone elsewhere in the world, where you have the famous political party Hizb ut-Tahrir, and you mentioned the movement in India and so on. Is it now kind of a more global phenomena?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I think it doesn't have really any political significance in Turkey. President Erdogan is not trying to revive the Ottoman Empire. I think a while ago, when there was a Turkish newspaper that sort of suggested bringing back the caliphate, and the Turkish government, Erdogan's government, very quickly came out and said, this is ridiculous. This is not what we want to do. We support the republic. So it's not actually significant in that sense. But what is true is that the idea of the caliphate is still very sort of dear to lots of Muslims around the world. Although what the caliphate would mean differs very much. And I'm thinking here of Dr. Ovamir Anjum's essay, Who Wants the Caliphate? And I know you've interviewed him.
He's a superb scholar and some fascinating, he's doing extraordinary work, actually, in very innovative and creative ways, rather than just rehashing old slogans. He's looking at it in a very nuanced way. Very impressive.
I think what he articulates very well is that the caliphate, the desire for the caliphate, is not really about some sort of mega super state, totalitarian state or something. It's about Muslim sovereignty and the famous Indian Muslim poet philosopher Sir Muhammad Iqbal. He believed that the Indian Muslims and Muslims in general would only be free when they could express themselves using their own language, using in their own terms, and not looking at themselves through the lens of sort of other civilizations that were being imposed onto them. And so that's never really...
Just to emphasize how important what you just said is, because we saw that recently with the World Cup in Qatar, where this tiny little state, in terms of its volume, geographically, came under huge pressure from the West, from politicians in Britain, the United States, Germany. The German football team, of course, made their protest. to change their society, their Islamic understanding of certain issues, which we won't go into. So you can see how vulnerable individual Muslim countries are to the hegemony, the pressure, one might call it neo-colonialism even, from the West. And so this talk of the caliphate then would be a kind of a natural reaction, saying we need a shield, we need a defensive, we need some kind of Ummah-wide identity, solidarity to protect them from these external pressures, to change them, their religion, their faith, their beliefs, which are not in accord with what's going on in Washington at any given moment, which of course constantly changes in America. You know, the latest fashions in whatever it is, and then they are made mandatory for the rest of the planet. Controversially there, anyway. That would be my take.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the revival of the caliphate is not sort of some imminent prospect, clearly. But what I would say is that the idea of Muslim solidarity and affinity between Muslims worldwide is an idea that is very much alive, and it shapes politics in many ways.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I don't think we can expect it to go away.
No, I don't see that happening. I mean, just finally, from the religious perspective, it's the more Islamic perspective, if one can put it that way. There are hadiths, are there not, which talk about these are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, where he talks about precisely the caliph, the successors to the Prophet. And without rehashing the hadith, maybe I should have written it down. I could rehearse it, but it was prophesied, because Muhammad was a prophet, of course. It was predicted that the caliphate would come to an end at some point in history, and then for a time without a caliph, and then it would return. So I've heard Muslims say to me on the basis of this that they have the promise of God that the caliph will return, the caliphate will return one day. I'm not saying it will be in our lifetimes or who it will be or whatever, but nevertheless, it gives a sense of we don't have to be too anxious or worried about, we've got to do something. Yes, we have maybe people have to do something, but there is ultimately God's initiative, it's God's plan, it is God's doing, rather than a kind of more Marxist activist thing. We've got to create utopia on earth, the communist society, we must do this and form, these agents. It will ultimately happen. But I'm not saying therefore that Muslims should be passive, but there is a sense of eschatological inevitability about it, if I can put it that way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. I think that's correct. And obviously it was cataclysmic, the abolition of the Khilafah, so for all the reasons that you mentioned, especially because it was a scholarly consensus really that the caliphate was absolutely important, and that you needed a caliphate. And so that's why it was so. But at the time that it was abolished, what was sort of relevant to everyone was the fact that this was a problem with Muslims not having any power in the world and being sort of totally under colonial rule at that time, so almost completely under colonial rule, and the Muslims had to sort of regain their own sort of independence and their sovereignty, and their ability to be Muslim on their own terms, and not sort of according to what various colonial powers, whether it be the British Empire or the French, wanted. And I think that idea that to be Muslim on our own terms,
yes,
that's still.
I like what you've just. I like how you phrase it: Muslim on our own terms. It's not you can be Muslim now, obviously in Qatar or Egypt, or wherever, but to actually be Muslim on our own terms, free of foreign, external, economic, military, hegemonic influence, or at least to have it sufficiently tilted in a Muslim direction, so there is real sovereignty, not just nominal sovereignty, is an amazing aspiration and a very natural understand. Non-Muslims should be able to understand that. It's not just a Muslim logic. It's there is an understandable raison d'être in that, I would argue.
Yeah, so it's not about some sort of fanaticism or, as you say, utopianism. It's not that at all. It's just I think it's something that's eminently reasonable. That's why.
It does strike one as being, I mean, to put it in more a different language, self-determination is eminently reasonable. It's not fanatical at all. And particularly when you have the theological domain, you have the eschatological promise of God in these hadith, which speak of it returning. So it's, my own perspective, my own view is, will I be around to see it? That would be interesting. But but you're right. What's another point you just made very briefly, I thought was really interesting. You talk about the normativity of this concept, the caliphate, and from what I can see, my own limited research, is that you're absolutely right. I mean, every school of thought, every madhab, this is ijma big time throughout history, the history of Islam. All the big names of it, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, you name it, they all agreed you need an imam, was another name for the caliph, a ruler, a leader, etc., to unify the Muslims, and not just religious reasons, but to collect zakat and to implement this and to have that. And it's just normative Islam. In other words, it's not really up for private opinion. This is Islam. It's a facet of it, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Imran Mullah, for an absolutely fascinating story about Prince Mukarrem Jah, who died in Istanbul at the age of 89 on the 14th of January. I mean, literally just over a week ago. And as you rightly say, few people knew that he was nominated caliph by the last Ottoman Caliph. I mean, it's extraordinary, to think that he was alive. I didn't know he existed, unfortunately, until I read your article, about which your article can be read on middleeasti.net. I'll link to it in the description below. There's some photographs of him, paintings of him, and other significant people associated with his life. Very interesting read. I don't want to embarrass you, Imran, but you are a very good writer. You're not boring, which is a possibility with writers, academic writers, I mean, are not always stimulating, even though they might be accurate and informative. But no, you're able to communicate actual content in an interesting way. And that's a talent indeed, which I'm sure we can all be grateful for. So much appreciated, Imran. And perhaps we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure. Anytime. Until next.